Good morning, everyone. I'm appreciative of that land acknowledgement this morning here in Toronto, as we have a beautiful day and the breeze is blowing outside of my window, and I just feel very grateful for the stewards of the air and the nature that sits on the land. So it's a great day to come together and have this conversation. So thank you to all of you for waking up early. I know for some people it's very early. We have folks from across North America and some from around the world, I hear. So welcome to all of you, whatever time zone you're in. I hope you're in your PJs if it's early and you're going to take in some morning inspiration. And if it's later in the morning, thank you for taking time out of your workday. Most especially, I get to moderate three people that I am such huge fans of. So I'm going to try and do as little talking as possible, with the exception of this introduction this morning. And we aren't going to have a Q&A because you'll see very quickly that this is such an incredible opportunity to leverage their big, bright minds. So if there's something really burning that I'm missing, please let us know in the chat or the Q&A. But we're going to let them take the conversation where it needs to go, and I'm going to gently guide along the way. So for those of you who are here, I am sure you have read their bios, but just in case you missed something super cool about one of our panelists, I'm just going to read them because I'm just to get myself even more excited, and then we will quickly turn it over to them to sort of set the context for the conversation. Um, so from the West Coast and very early, we have Tamika L Butler. So, special props to Tamika for waking up early. Tamika is a national expert and a speaker on issues related to the built environment, equity, anti-racism, diversity and inclusion, organizational behavior, and change management. Boy, the world needs you right now, Tamika. Most recently, she was the Director of Planning, California, and the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Tool Design. Previously, Tamika served as the executive director of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, a nonprofit organization that addresses social and racial equity and wellness by building parks and gardens in park-poor communities across greater Los Angeles. Chúk Odenigbo, director of Ancestral Services for Future Ancestors. Chúk is a Black Franco-Albertan from Calgary. He is passionate about interactions between health, culture, and the environment. This passion inspired him to pursue a PhD in medical geography at the University of Ottawa after completing his master's degree in environmental health at the School of Public Health at the University of Montreal. Chúk was ranked amongst the top 30 change-making Albertans under 30 by the Young Franco-Albertan Leaders by Radio-Canada and the top 25 environmentalists under 25 in Canada by the Starfish for 3 years. And finally, Guillermo Penalosa, founder and chair of 880 Cities. As you'll see in one hot second, he is very passionate about cities for all people. He advises decision makers and communities on how to create vibrant cities and healthy communities for everyone, regardless of age, gender, social, economic, or ethnic background. His focus is on the design and use of parks and streets as great public places, as well as sustainable mobility, walking, riding bicycles, using public transit, and new use of cars. Guillermo is the founder and chair of the board of the successful Canadian nonprofit organization 880 Cities. He is also the chair of the board for World Urban Parks, the international representative body for city parks, open space, and the recreation center. So, sector, not center. Freudian slip. It's still kind of early over here. So welcome to all of you. We're so excited for this conversation. And just for those of you who showed up for a conversation on the next chapter of urbanism, we decided to narrow it in a little bit and really focus, given the deep experience, knowledge, and ideas of the folks that we have joining us today. We've really decided to focus on equitable access to public spaces that are meant to be for our collective public interest and public good. And so how we're going to start the morning is we're going to have each of the panelists just tell us what's on your mind in the context of this conversation right now. What have you been thinking? What needs to be in the conversation to give us some fodder for today's discussion. So we are going to start with Chúk. So I'm going to give you a few minutes. Tell us, what's on your mind in the context of equitable access to public space right now in this moment.
Hello, bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everyone, or I guess whatever time of day it is where you're at. Thank you for that introduction. It is always really awkward listening to your own bio, and you're just like, wow. But yeah, good morning. Hello. So this is super exciting. I'm actually super excited to sort of be having this conversation because parks is something that has been very sort of important to me throughout my life. And it's really exciting to be in a change-making space when it comes to parks, to sort of have those discussions with people in parks to sort of see the ways in which we can make parks better and more accessible for human beings and also better for nature as well. So as Zahra mentioned, I'm one of the directors of Ancestral Services at Future Ancestral Services. So we are a young company that sort of seeks to make Canada a better country for the next generation of Canadians. And we do this at well, three routes of action. So through social justice, equity, and the environment, sort of recognizing that the environment is the key component of making sure that we have a better country, of making sure that people feel more safe and more comfortable and more secure in their country. And so that is one of my main passions is sort of how we can sort of diversify outdoor spaces and have everyone feel welcome in nature and have everyone feel like nature is for them. So speaking to a very Canadian context, in Canada, we've actually sort of branded nature, right? Like, close your eyes and sort of think about like, what do you think about when you think of an outdoorsy person? What comes to mind? I remember when I was younger, an outdoorsy person, remember I'm growing up in Alberta, an outdoorsy person, is this like white dude with dreadlocks who's super hippie and very like, tie dye and all that fun stuff. And nowadays, there's a lot of different images that go around, but essentially, if you don't correlate to the image you have in your mind when you think of an outdoorsy person or when you think of an environmentalist, you think, oh, this is not my jam. This is not for me. This is not my thing. And that makes you feel excluded from those spaces. And you just sort of assume that those spaces aren't for you. And so, as someone who is a Black Francophone, who is very into fashion and all these different sort of things, going to outdoor spaces and people would be like, are you really going to wear that white dress shirt to go hunting? I'm like, yes. Yes, I am going to wear that white dress shirt to go hunting. I will absolutely look stunning as I kill that moose. That is going to happen. Or, when you go hiking, I've had people actually come up to me and be like, you know, let me show you where to go. Do you know where you are? And I'm like, why? What makes me look lost? Do I look lost? Do I look confused? And that whole idea of people aren't used to seeing Black people hiking. People aren't used to seeing all these different things. And so sort of diversifying outdoor spaces, those of us who are in Canada, we live in the most multicultural country in the world. Yet if we branded nature as being for a very sort of specific ethnicity or a specific group of people, that excludes a lot of people. And then just switching into sort of a generational discussion as well. The other issue that I sort of have with parks, and I'm hoping to rectify in park spaces, is this romanticization of the past. As Molly sort of mentioned in the land acknowledgement, parks have historically been used as a tool of colonization, right? The whole idea of like, let's conserve this place from human beings. And so let's kick out the people who've been living in harmony with nature in this space so that we can then conserve the space. So there's that whole aspect of parks, which has a very sort of negative legacy and very negative history. But then we also look at this whole notion of disconnect and go outdoors, right? My generation was a generation where technology really sort of got introduced, and then the generation after me was born with technology. And so it's part of our life, it's part of our existence, and many futurists are predicting that human beings are going to become part technology as we move forward into the future. That's sort of the way we're evolving at the moment. And so to tell someone who's grown up with technology, to tell someone who is part of their existence, no, put that aside and connect to nature. You're creating this dichotomy that doesn't need to exist, right? What does it change in my experience if I'm out there on my phone playing on Instagram, but sitting on a park bench versus if I left my phone at home? Like, why is it so important that I leave that phone behind, right? So we need to like question these and challenge these notions, because what that's doing is that's creating a dichotomy where a lot of young people don't feel comfortable in outdoor spaces because they have this idea of, oh, if I'm going to go out into the woods, I must disconnect. So, I'm not going to do it now, maybe in a couple months when I'm feeling better, or maybe I'll just like take a break and then I'll go for a weekend, but that's it. And so then we're getting this whole idea of like, these don't mix, and there's no actual reason why these should not mix, right? So you've got that whole generational gap. And then to sort of close off that romanticization of the past, I saw this article in the Globe and Mail that came out as a result of COVID, this whole idea of, you know, let your children sort of go out and play like they used to in the past. Remember when you used to be able to like go out and do this and do that and not have to worry about X, Y, Z. And it bugs me because once again, that whitens like outdoor spaces once again, right? Because so many minorities, many people of color especially, always say that this is the best time to be a person of color. And there's still a lot of things that we have to struggle with and a lot of things that we have to fight against. But this is actually today the best time to be a person of color. Because 5, 10, 20 years ago, you could not go out without being harassed for your skin color, being harassed for your sexuality, being harassed for your gender, right? Girls weren't really allowed outdoors. And so you've got all of these things that you used to have in the past that we like to have a habit of forgetting, being like, oh yeah, no, parks have always been like that, yada, yada, yada. It's like, no, that's not true. It's right. It's like, the parks are only accessible to a very specific segment of the population. And now we're trying to make parks accessible to everyone. So romanticizing the past instead of ignoring what those barriers were is inherently negative. So yeah, those are some of my first thoughts in the morning. I'm not the most coherent as I'm trying to speak English right now, but yeah.
Well, I mean, I have a list in front of me, and I love that you're pulling us out of the binary, right? I love that you're pulling us out of the zero sum game. And I hope that there's a lot of young people on this call who just breathes a sigh of relief as we go into this conversation, that there is permission to break this sort of outdated and, old patriarchal archetype of who gets to be outside. So thank you for setting that. We will come back to so many things that you said. Tamika, I want to give you some time.
Sure. Good morning. Thanks for having me. It is early in Los Angeles, but I did voluntarily say I would do this because I'm so excited about the other folks on this panel, and I really appreciate what the organization is doing. And just building off what we just heard, I totally agree. I think for me, when I think about parks, and frankly, when I think about anything built environment, whether or not it's transportation or access to green space or housing and stability, I am constantly trying to center the experience of Black and Indigenous people, as well as anybody who's really been part of a group that has been oppressed. And so I think often when we're thinking about public space, we aren't thinking about what public space would be if you were Indigenous in that space, if you were Black, if you were racialized in any way, if you were disabled, if you were queer. And so I think because I fit many of those groups, I'm constantly thinking about those things. And, I think we're in a time now where more people are talking about some of these issues on the surface, but more is kind of virtue signaling. Look how woke I am, look how not racist I am, I care about these things. But they don't want to have the deeper conversation about the fact that our park system here in the United States, our national park system was started by someone who was an admitted racist, right? Someone who wrote a book talking about how people of color were less than, were diluting the human race. Someone who wrote a book that Hitler has held up and said, this is something I think of like a Bible. And that is a person who started our parks program. And so often parks have been used to take land from people and then to then charge other people to get back into the land that doesn't even belong to them, right? And I think I'm constantly aware as I sit in Los Angeles on stolen Tongva land, I'm deeply aware of the fact that many of us are just settlers, right? And even though my people were not brought here, even were not asked if they wanted to come here, were enslaved, I think we as folks of color have really intimate relationships with the outdoors, with being outside, with being in space. And I think that was then when we were, working in the fields, picking cotton. And I think it's now when you see migrants and immigrants working in the fields, picking things. And I think there is this idea that folks of color, people aren't used to seeing us as hikers. People aren't used to seeing us outdoors. But the reality, people aren't, when they think of an environmentalist, they don't think of us. But many of us grew up in households where we were deeply rooted to the outdoors, where we were deeply rooted to recycling, reusing, throwing nothing away, turning off all the lights, not using air conditioning because we either didn't have it, or if we did have it, you only really, 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 really used it when you needed it, right? Constantly, who can we pick up and give a ride to on the way and share a car with if we have to take a car, right? So I think these are issues we've thought about, and these are issues that are deeply tied to who we are. And now that we have COVID-19 upon us and ravaging our countries from the very top, we have to acknowledge that when we think of who is outside now, and who's outside by choice as a lifestyle, and who's outside because they are still our essential workers. We are still depending on them to give of themselves outside. I think for people who still feel somewhat uncomfortable with talking about race or oppressed groups when we talk about some of these issues, have to realize that that's an immense privilege, because the two issues are intrinsically tied together. They always have been, and they always will be. And so when we think of parks, especially in a time where people say, you've been inside too long, you have to get out, you have to get fresh air, you have to be willing to think about the fact that, especially as a Black person in this country, especially as a person who is gender nonconforming, and that's whether or not I'm in the States or whether or not I'm in Canada, given that I've spent significant time in both places, it's not the same. It's not as easy as just getting outside. We don't get to just get outside. And I think right now you have a number of people, as Chúk just said, who are like, oh, I just want to get back to the time when I could just go outside and not worry about this and not worry about this and not worry about this. And I think what those folks have to realize is that for many of us, we constantly have to worry about sitting on a bench too long in a park and whether or not someone thinks we belong there. Hanging out in a park with our friends and knowing that someone may call the police just because it's a group of too many people of color and they're suspicious. Constantly wondering whether or not you belong in a place, not because of how you feel connected to the space, but because of how other people want to police that space. And so I'll end by just saying, I think this conversation is important because, again, these issues have always been directly related to this work. And it's nice to have some folks finally starting to pay attention to that.
Yeah, Tamika, you're bringing up something that's come up, I think in a lot of conversations I've had with colleagues in early June, right after George Floyd was murdered, where their bosses were saying, take 10 minutes, just go for a walk. And they're like, going for a walk isn't a break. Going for a walk and being outside, especially in this moment, is not a break. So even if there's a park across the street, that's not respite for me. And hearing the exasperation and pain of how quickly people could access the respite of public space, how some folks could, and racialized folks, specifically Black folks, and right in that moment, even more pronounced, we're finding it absolutely exasperating to hear. Just take 10 minutes. Go for a walk. Mm-hmm. So thank you for bringing that into the conversation. And again, we'll come back to all of this. Guillermo, I'm going to time you 5 minutes. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Okay, 5 minutes. Great to be with you, Zahra, and Chúk and Tamika. Less than a year ago, we were working on how can we create cities that are equitable and sustainable? How can we have all people that are going to live healthier and happier? How to develop a sense of urgency. Why a sense of urgency? Because within half of the homes that will be around in 40 years around the world do not exist today. Half of the homes. We're going to go from 3.5 billion people living in cities to 7 billion. And it's not just in Latin America and Africa and India and some other parts of Asia. It's also like all of the large cities in Canada as well as all of the medium and large cities in Southeast and Southwest the US, are going to grow by over 50% in the next 30 years. 50% in the next 30 years. So, and we need to realize that what we have done, how we've been creating cities in the last 30, 40, 50 years, mostly is horrible. A few is okay, and very isolated, like acupuncture, is good. It's not sustainable from the point of view environmental. It's not good for physical and mental health. It's not good for mobility. It's not good for equity. And then COVID arrived. And some people say everything changed. I think very few things have changed. I think COVID arrived and we have a magnifying glass in issues such as equity. I have worked in over 350 different cities all over the world, in every continent, small ones, rich ones, poor ones. And I've seen equity problems everywhere. Discrimination by gender, by race, by age, by religion, by ethnicity. I mean, in New York, they were saying too many Black people and Hispanics are dying, overrepresented. No, it was the poor Black people and the poor Hispanics. The wealthy Hispanics and the poor Black were not dying. And then they said, oh, you gotta keep 2 meters distance, 6 feet. But nevertheless, we realized that our sidewalks, you cannot keep 2 meters distance because the sidewalks are not wide enough. 24% of the streets in Toronto, 24% do not even have a sidewalk. They said, oh, walk to the parks. Well, in the US, the wealthiest country in the world, over 100 million people living in cities, 1 out of 3 do not have a park within walking distance, and it's mostly in the poor neighborhoods where overwhelmingly Black and Hispanic and so on people live. In Toronto, the tree canopy in the wealthy areas is 3 times more than in the poor areas. So we have these big issues. I mean, and I wish we were changing, but I don't think we're changing, and at least not fast enough. As an example, on Friday, Toronto City Council voted to don't do any sidewalks where the councillors were requested not to do sidewalks, when sidewalks is a human rights issue. The city council failed to even ask the province not to waste $2.8 billion to have an LRT above ground instead of underground. It failed to even ask people to think if the public golf courses should be parks. So instead of having 200 people for just 6 months of the year, they would have thousands and thousands of people every single day. So I think that we gotta improve democracy. We need to have ranked ballots everywhere. We need to have term limits. We need to engage people everywhere, people of all ages and races and ethnicities and religions and backgrounds and everything. We need to develop alliances. And let me end this brief introduction by doing an analogy. It's like 2 brothers. One of them is a car mechanic. The other one is a heart surgeon. And the mechanic told the other one, oh, you know, we pretty much do the same because I fix the heart of the cars. And then he says, yeah, you know, we're pretty much the same, except that you stop the car for a week or a month or however you need to work on it. I need to fix the heart of the person as if the car was going at 100 kilometers an hour. So we need to create cities in a different way as the cities are growing, as people are arriving. We cannot say, oh, we should not grow more in Toronto. No, we are going to have 50% more population in the next 30 years. Where are they going to live? How are they going to live? How are we going to end this huge problem of equity? I mean, we need to really work. We need to do things differently if we really expect to have cities that are more equitable and more sustainable, and where people of all ages and races and ethnicities can live healthier and happier. We need to act today. In order to have that, we need to have a shared vision of the cities that we want. But it's not only about a vision. We need to have action, lots of action.
Thanks, Guillermo. Thanks for keeping on time. I think you just got a presidential nomination for somewhere in the chat. I do want to just pick up on that piece around vision. And, you know, I think to Tamika's earlier point, there have been many visions for cities, and where we are today, you could argue, is by design. You know, the sort of white patriarchal sort of old colonial mindset that, you know, designed the way we have the public realm, so whether it's sidewalks, whether it's parks, whether it's a public square, that was all by design. And push back if you don't agree. I wanted to put it out to all of you that, you know, what are some of our norms around urbanism that kind of need to be addressed in this moment? Because I think that there's a lot of unchallenged wisdom that shapes urbanism, but yet here we are in cities where there are places, there are inequitable distribution of pretty much everything: green space, canopy, sidewalks, you know, repairs on sidewalks. What are some of the conventional norms in the urbanism space that we just need to address, say goodbye to, this typical behavior that, you know, and maybe even blind spots, like even behavior that's supposed to advance the public good, but is not? What is some of that? Just to get the context of how we arrived here, because I think, you know, there was the old colonial visions of public space, and then there's been so much work since by great folks like all of you. What's some of that core wisdom that needs to be addressed and challenged around the way we shape public space? This is to all of you.
I'm happy to start. I think the space centers whiteness, and I think it really centers white able-bodiedness. I think a lot of the work that has been done historically centers the experience of being a white able-bodied man of a certain age. And so when we think about anything from, you know, what feels safe in a park at night, or what will be comfortable as you wait for a bus, or whatever it may be, I think that part of the problem is that we've historically had a group of folks planning space that don't reflect the people who we say we want to use the space. And that has been a huge problem. And you know, to your question, I don't know that I think it's an accident. In fact, I don't think it's an accident. I think we have for generations intentionally planned against people. And I think as regions get more and more diverse, it is no longer appropriate to call racialized people minorities, because there are more folks who are racialized than not. I think that space and planning have been used as a way to keep certain people in their place, keep certain people in their neighborhoods, on their side of the tracks, out of our neighborhoods. And I think sometimes people say it in a coded way, right? The president of our country saying things like, I want to protect your suburbs. And then I think sometimes people are just straight up. When we go to community meetings, or when we go to a city council meeting, and folks just straight up say, well, we don't want that kind of housing here. Or, well, we're worried if we put a park here. You know, when I used to work at an organization that built parks and gardens, it should not surprise folks how many people sometimes complain about parks, because then who's gonna come hang out in the park? Are teenagers gonna skip school and hang out here? Are we gonna have to listen to a lot of loud birthday parties on the weekend? And so none
What
of
a
this
terrible
is on,
sound. A loud
right?
birthday party. Like, oh my
Like,
God.
and none of this is on accident, because they don't mean their birthday parties, right?
Yeah.
And so I think so often the idea of safety, the idea of inclusion, and the idea of belonging have all been completely exclusive to those who have not historically held power. And if, as those who are historically empowered, and again, you know, white folks, and in our profession, older white men, as they are slowly starting to see things change and their power potentially slipping away, oftentimes what's unfortunate is, rather than making space for these new ideas, these new voices, these new ways of thinking about things, they just hold on tighter.
Yeah.
And they just plan more and make more rules to continue to keep certain folks out. And I think that is something that we have to continue to deal with and really attack head on.
Chuck,
Okay.
Chuck, you looked like you were going to say something. I just was busy writing grip tighter, plan more, make more rules. It's a behavioral norm that it seems like we need to break or address. Chuck, sorry to interrupt.
I should stop allowing Tamika to speak before me because, dear Jesus, that is hard to follow up. But no, I fully agree with everything Tamika said, and I want to like actually add in a public health lens to all of this as we're talking about planning. We so in the West, and each country is very different, so it's really fascinating to kind of see how this shaped. But in the West, largely, we have this we used to so actually I'm going to tell it in a storytelling form. So in the past, in ancient Greek mythology, there were two goddesses, Igi and Panacea, which are their French names. Don't know the English names, don't know the Greek names. They were sisters, and they were sisters who presented health. And so Igi, which is where we get the English word hygiene from, was the sister who sort of represented the whole idea of like the environmental impacts on human health. And then Panacea was all about remedies and solutions. And so in the past, Igi was like the goddess to be, right? Like whenever there's an issue, we looked at the environment. We're like, what's wrong with the environment? You know, is something going wrong? What's wrong with the social system? So that we could fix health issues. And then Louis Pasteur was able to prove that microbes exist and germs exist and whatnot. And so the whole concept of health became interiorized. It's like, okay, let's look inside the body to see what's going on and to look for the problem. And so Panacea became the god to be, and everyone forgot about Igi. And then now in our societies, we're starting to realize the importance of the environment to human health, right? There's only so much we can do in terms of remedies and fixing things, but there's so much we can also do in terms of preventing in the first place. And so COVID is a really great example of this because we don't have a fix yet for COVID, but we have created societies that aren't very resilient. We have created societies where health was an afterthought. Right. Once again, speaking to what Tamika said, where these societies were designed for, able-bodied people. Because if we had been designing for people who were not able-bodied, our society would already be more resilient. Our sidewalks would be wider, if for no other reason than to better accommodate wheelchairs. Right. So you've got all of that sort of encoded in it, and then we also have to think about what parks and what green space means societally, like what that means contextually. So in English and in French, we have this really interesting habit of feminizing nature, right? I always say Mother Nature, boats and everything are always female. When we're talking about like something in the water, we're like, oh, there she blows, all these like female terms. And so but in a society that also is sexist, in a society that, there's a pay gap difference, we're not Iceland in Canada, we're not Iceland. There is that pay gap difference. There is difference in the way women are treated and the way women experience Canada versus with the way a man experiences Canada. And so in a society that has not fully embraced and welcomed the full bodily autonomy and value of women, how can we then take something that we feminized and appreciate its full autonomy, right? So whenever we talk about something being useful, in terms of nature, we always talk about ecosystemic services. We're like, okay, this is useful to keep clean because we get clean drinking water from that. That's useful because of X, Y, Z. But what about just valuing it for the sake of it exists, right? What about that whole idea of like, well, that tree is useful because it exists. That tree is valuable because it exists. I don't know if it gives me fruit. I have no idea if it does anything really, but it exists. Therefore, it is of value. And then we also have to question the whole idea of like indigenous coding and Black coding the environment. Kind of as Tamika mentioned in her intro, Black people have always been sort of associated with outdoor spaces, even though people get shocked when Black people hike, right? The whole idea of like, Black people having to cross the waters and then Black people being in the fields. And then nowadays when we see a lot of Black people on TV in an African context, it tends to be African traditional living, once again, in outdoors or the nature spaces, in agricultural spaces, or then we think about like indigenous people and their relationship with the land. And so if we look at pop culture and the way pop culture portrays Earth, if we look at environmental abilities, if you watch Frozen 2, the Earthbirds in this Scandinavian Disney retelling, are black coded. They look like black people. If you look at Avatar with the blue people, they are very much designed in sort of like an indigenous but also African style. If you look at Avatar The Last Urban, if you look at the Earth Kingdom, like a lot of the traits that they take into the Earth Kingdom are very much black coded. And so you have this idea of like we're subtly black coding or indigenous coding in brown and green spaces. And so then the question becomes, can we respect nature if we don't respect those who we see as representatives of nature and of the environment? And so that's not being taken into consideration in the planning, and it's evident, right? And yeah, I will stop there because I think I was talking too long.
No, there's no talking too long. We're going to extend this to 3 hours as of right now because there's so much to talk about. So Molly, just do the thing. No, just kidding. We'll be done by 12. But I'm glad we don't Q&A right now because there's so much to pick up on what you just said. There's like something so profound about thinking about how we feminize nature and then we abuse it and we mistreat it, and just thinking about the analogs when it comes to any kind of marginalized or intersectional body. In our cities and in our communities, and how we, by extension, treat them. So that's profound. And I think, Guillermo, you were trying to jump in.
Well, no, I just want to say that I think that equity is a huge problem. Equity, regardless of the race, is the poor people. Also, I want to say that things are very different in the US than Canada because we tend to oversimplify in Canada and assume that is the same. And the other day I saw some professors doing a strike, and in their document of the strike, every single case that they announced was in the US. I mean, the reality is, even from the race point of view, the Black population in Canada is 3% of the population. Toronto, the city with the most Black population, is 8%. But nevertheless, we are 52% visible minority. And there is discrimination against that 8% of Blacks, but there is also discrimination against the other 44% of visible minorities that are not Black, that are from Pakistan, and from India, and from China. And it's nothing new. I mean, people from China, they were brought over 100 years ago to build railroads, and we're still discriminating. Of course, all indigenous. So I think that the umbrella is bigger. At the same time, in the US, over 40% of the Black population do not even have access to health. Here in Canada, everybody has access to health. So it's different. When I was working in Colombia, in Bogota as commissioner, we built over 200 parks in one term. Then my brother became mayor and did hundreds more. In 2 terms, we built over 1,000 parks. And I remember, and almost all of them were in the low or extreme poverty areas. A very few that were done in the upper income areas. I remember some of the upper income were saying, oh, we don't want children's playgrounds. What do you mean? Don't you have children? Oh, yes, but they don't play in the park. They play in the country club. They didn't want children's areas because they didn't want the poor people or the children or grandchildren or the people that work from them to come to the park. I mean, last year I was working in Nairobi, and I went through some of the poorest slums in Nairobi. In Nairobi, 13 out of 100 trips are done by car. Nevertheless, at this moment, the city is building a highway right through the middle of the city when 13% have cars and 87% do not. And this road doesn't have sidewalks, doesn't have protected bikeways, doesn't have a bus lanes with BRTs. So this is an issue of equity. So I think we really need to focus on the problems of equity everywhere and all kinds of discriminations of people of all ages, also all races and ethnicities.
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking to a place close to my heart. Nairobi is where I was born. My family was settlers there as part of the intergenerational settling in different places because of religious persecution, and was just recently there and saw that highway, and it was gobsmacking to see infrastructure that's built not to serve any real human need. I want to pick up on a comment, this like idea that people can be characterized homeless, poor, whatever. And I think there's a growing discomfort with any characterization because it lacks an intersectional lens, which is, our identities are so fluid from moment to moment, and to capture people in one moment in their lives and then design for them or not design for them in that moment is part of why we have so much exclusion in our cities right now. And I think there's a growing understanding of that intersectional approach to city building, and that idea that we have different components of our identity that, when compounded, create barriers. which to me is this sort of like hopeful moment for cities. And the fact that the four of us are having this conversation is hopeful. And, you know, you've each pointed out sort of really core pieces that have been put in place to design us to get us to this moment. And I'm just wondering, you know, we're having this conversation, there's an understanding in some city building communities that things need to change. What are you seeing change in this moment? Like, it feels like we're crossing a threshold. I know my career, Guillermo, has been, you know, a little shorter than yours, but for the 15 years that I've been in the city building space, I think for the rest of us, you know, we're starting to see that at the very least there's an increasing spaces to name things and talk about them. But what is happening in this moment for you? Are you feeling urbanism change? I know, Tamika, you were saying, yeah, you know, people want to talk about the surface. They don't really want to go deep. Are we feeling like, is there a palpable, visceral sense that the urbanism community is starting to go beyond that in any way? And what are some of those indicators that things are starting to change?
Well, this time we'll change the order. No, I just wanted to make comment that especially many young people that are watching, stop being politically correct. Things will not change by themselves. It's not by magic that we got COVID and things are going to change. It's not because we have Black Lives Matter that things are going to change. We need to act. We need to turn the movement into into change into organization. Just to give you an example, Toronto is the most multicultural city in the world. And under Mayor Tory, all of the positions, executive positions at the top level, the city manager, the 3 deputy city managers, the general managers of transportation, of parks, of environment, of public health, everyone is white. Everyone that have been appointed under John Tory. So I did my Canadian experience in Mississauga, where Mississauga has had over 50% visible minorities. And at that time, of the top 120 city staff, 2 were visible minority. So we do need to change things. And for example, even under COVID, Toronto does an open streets. They take cars out on Sunday, which is really, really nice for people to walk and bike and skate. But all of it is along Lake Ontario, the wealthy and wider areas of the city. Why don't we take an advantage? And this could be done in any city, not just Toronto. I've seen it work in cities of 10,000, 100,000 millions. Why don't we create a network of car-free streets on Sundays so that we connect the poorest neighbors in the city with the wealthiest? Why do then we say, oh, it's because the Black people or the Indians or the Pakistani, they don't want to ride bicycles. Well, if we only do this in the wealthy and wider part of the city by the lake, no, come on, let's connect the city. Let's take advantage of this moment. By the way, let's keep in mind that we have a short window. This fact that today we got fewer cars on the streets and people are open-minded about creating bicycle corridors. If we don't develop networks, if we don't start changing more, but somehow we need to stop being mute. One last example, we are wasting, it's not an issue of money, we're wasting billions and billions. The Premier of Ontario says, we're gonna have an LRT in a low density area, which wide road, and he says, no, I wanna put it underground. The cost of putting it underground is $2.8 billion. That is the equivalent almost of $1,000 for every man, woman, child in Toronto. We have huge problems of equity. Are we gonna do that? From the point of view of parks, we've been saving money and we got about 1.5 billion that we could put in parks. And some people wanna put it in one park on top of the railway, the rail deck park. What's more equitable, to put 1.5 billion in one park or to put 1 million in 1,500 parks, or maybe 10 million in 150 parks? Or maybe put 500 million in all of the ravine system and the other billion into, I mean, we really, everything that we do in the city, everything should have a lens of equity. And we are not doing it and people are mute. I don't see the presidents of the university saying anything about it. I don't see presidents of foundations, of civic organizations. We need to be louder. We need to be respectful. Politically correct is dumb. We need to say what's on our mind. We need to act. But somehow People think that that being Canadian is staying mute, is being silent. I think that is a huge. I love Canada. I became Canadian. I live here. My children live here. I want to give back as much as possible. But being Canadian is not being politically correct. It's not being mute. We need to speak loud and clear because things need to change.
Speaking of being on mute, Tamika, I wanted to hear you laugh at the Rail Deck Park piece because I was surprised that news gets out to Los Angeles about about our park
Yeah,
planning.
I've heard a lot about that park plan. And I also, I talk a lot about my wife, who's French Canadian, and there is something that is very different from like her first Thanksgiving at my family, where no one is polite, where we say exactly what we think, and we're not afraid to have those confrontations and to have real discussions. And then my first Canadian Thanksgiving, where we were all very polite. And there, I think there is a reason people all over the world really enjoy Canadians, because they think you all are kind, nice people. But I agree, we're not going to get we're not going to get through racial injustice from just being kind. The reason that we describe these moments as struggles is because it's a struggle. And very few people have ever gotten liberation or freedom from politely asking for it. And that's just human nature. I have a 2-year-old, and sometimes I get things from politely asking, but sometimes I don't, right? And I think as a parent, I have to know when certain things will work and not work. And as someone who is a parent in a pandemic, I also don't judge other parents if they lose it or if they're yelling or if something's going on. And so I think there is this way in which we like to judge other people for how they express their desire for change, how they express their pain and their anguish of years of oppression. And I think that's not okay. We create these systems where we say, well, now we're going to let people engage. We're going to do participatory planning or budgeting or this or that, and we're going to have these meetings. They're not going to be linguistically appropriate. They're not going to be at times that work for people. They're not going to be at places that work for people. They're not going to include daycare or food or any of these things. And then we're like, but why aren't people engaged? And so I think we have to stop figuring out, how do we create something that works within our systems and get those folks to participate in our systems, and figure out, what about our systems? Do we just have to blow up and start over? Do we just have to completely burn down and rethink? And I absolutely agree. Are we at this time of change? I'm a person who's hopeful right now. I think there are more people talking about race and racism than ever before. I don't think people fully want to talk about anti-Blackness. I don't think people fully want to understand that the experience of being Black, and something Guillermo said is like, oftentimes it's about the poor Black people. And that's just not my experience. Because when people see me, they don't know if I'm poor or not. They don't know if I have a degree from one of the best universities in our country. And when I'm out at a grocery store and in a hoodie and a baseball cap and baggy pants, they don't know anything about me. And that's why you have, professors at Harvard who get pulled over on their own campus. That's why in Los Angeles, you have the vice president of one of the biggest fashion houses in the world who just got stopped and patted down and frisked and thrown against a building for jaywalking, right? And it's not any different than the experience of the poor Black man in South Central LA who got killed by police officers for a bike infraction. And it doesn't, my wealth and my education, certainly they open up certain doors, they allow me to be on panels, but it doesn't take away the color of my skin. And I think that's the piece, that as much as I'm hopeful, and as much as I hope things are changing, I also live this life in a Black body. And that Black body doesn't change whether or not I'm in the United States, whether or not I'm in Canada, whether or not I'm in Japan, where I grew up, whether or not I'm in Spain, wherever I have traveled, there is a derogatory term for someone who is Black. I have been called that term, and that doesn't change. And so for me, if we are truly going to get past where we are. And if things are truly going to be different, I co-sign Guillermo 100%. There has to be action, because just talking about it isn't going to do anything. We have enough people who are talking about it. We have enough allies who will stand up and send one of us an email after this and say, like, that was great. We have enough allies who, in a meeting, when we say something and it is completely ignored, or people say, well, why are you being so angry, Tamika? They will, after the meeting, say, I really appreciate you. I'm glad you're on this team. Thanks for speaking up. But those are not accomplices. Those are not people who are willing to risk something, because all of us speaking up, being our authentic selves, we're willing to risk jobs. We're willing to risk interviews. We're willing to risk money and all of these things. And so what we actually need are folks who are willing to risk something, who are willing to speak up when we're talking about, you know, sidewalk dining and how great it is. Just because there's not someone who has a disability in the room who's like, but now I can't get down the sidewalk. We have to be brave enough to speak up. And until we have more accomplices, more people who are willing to lose something, and often their power, their position, the thing they feel like they've worked hard for because they're not willing to acknowledge their privilege, until that happens, I don't know that we're going to completely change. And I think to make that happen, it's going to have to be a struggle, and it's not going to be polite.
So I hate to interrupt this, and it's 11:58. I'm going to ask for 1 minute closing comments from each of you, and specifically on this point of politeness. And Tamika, your quote about liberation doesn't come by politely asking for it. So for all the allies, potential accomplices, for the folks who are experiencing the anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism on the street who are listening into this, what is something we can not politely ask for? What should we be not politely asking for from our, you know, our friends who are listening in? And very quickly, maybe one sentence.
So I'm going to take up more than one sentence because I actually disagree a little bit.
Okay.
I think, and this is one of the strengths of Canada, is our politeness. I think, so just kind of speak to what Guillermo said and what Tamika said as well, is I think young people, especially during this time of COVID, but in the past couple of years have been revolutionizing spaces quite a bit, right? We saw the climate, the Fridays for the Future marches. We saw like a lot of BLM marches are very much young people or started by young people. All these equity issues are being brought up. I see a lot of young disabled YouTubers speaking up. I see a lot of Indigenous TikTokers, Indigenous influencers speaking up. And so what we're seeing right now is we're seeing the full spectrum of what it means to be a Canadian activist taking place in Canada. And so we see the people on the streets saying, defund the police, do this, do that, allocate more money towards parks, towards infrastructure, towards shared goods, shared commons, and really making those demands loud, clear, and direct. And then you have your boardroom activists, right? You've got your young people who are in those boardrooms who are navigating those office politics to then say, you know, let's bring in a diversity speaker and let's start that conversation. Let us start talking. Let us switch our language from saying climate change to saying climate justice. Let us change the way in which we approach things. And they're doing it very politely because we need that politeness. Because Canadian, as the most multicultural country in the world, we don't have the luxury of being direct. Being direct implies a shared culture, right? And as a multicultural country, we don't have that shared culture, right? We already have two distinct linguistic groups that have very different cultures. The way I grew up in Alberta is very different from someone who looks like me who grew up in Toronto. Very different lives. We have nothing in common. You know what I mean? The discrimination we face in downtown Calgary and discrimination I would face in downtown Toronto, the discrimination I face in Gatineau, they look different. You know what I mean? So we live in a country that is so incredibly diverse in every way, shape, and form that we don't have the luxury of being direct. We don't have the luxury of saying, this is what's on my mind, right? Because you hear people say, oh my God, oil and gas needs to shut down for the environment. And then that puts a stop on other people and they're like, I'm not listening to you. Yet Albertans, because I grew up there, are some of the most environmentally friendly people I know. Everyone I know no matter how embedded they are in the oil and gas industry, they recycle, they go to bank, they love doing outdoor sports, they love connecting nature. When Jason Kenney was like, let's privatize parks, they fought, right? People were like, that is not your voter base. Your voter base does not want parks privatized, right? And so you've got these nuances that are happening. And we live in a country filled with those nuances. So we need the people who are direct, and we need the people who are loud and who are on the streets, because they raise awareness, they bring issues to the forefront. But then we also need the politeness, and we cannot ignore that. So that is, I just wanted to like emphasize that, right? It's like, political correctness is necessary, because what political correctness has done, especially for people who look like me, especially for young people, political correctness brings me to the table. Someone looks at the table and is like, oh my God, everyone on this table is white. We need to have someone who's not white. That is political correctness at work. Political correctness is people realizing that, oh, you can't say certain things around people who look like me. That would make me uncomfortable. So you're gonna keep quiet about it. So I don't have to do the emotional dealing with your awkward words. Right? It's like, that is what political correctness is. Political correctness has empowered people who often don't have a voice, who haven't historically been given to be able to speak and to be able to have space, because people know it is not politically correct to make a comment about my skin color. It is not politically correct to try and make like a joke about my age. It is not politically correct to do a lot of these different things. And so that allows me to be able to speak up in a space knowing that it's a safe space, because political correctness has created that culture of safety. I don't want political correctness trashed. I don't want politeness trashed, because they all have their place and they're all incredibly necessary in creating and invoking change.
I love this.
Yeah, I agree with that. I totally agree with that. I think you need people who are going to shout in the streets, and you need people who are going to work the moves behind the scenes. I just think as folks all in a movement together, we have to support everybody who has a different part to play. But I also think we have to acknowledge the reality that Martin Luther King might have been viewed as a very peaceful man, and we may reflect on that now, but in the moment, he was still one of the most hated people. And so I think that for those of us who have gotten to the seat in the table and had a place in the boardrooms, we also realize that sometimes, no matter how polite you are, when people feel like you're asking for something that makes them uncomfortable, you know, if politeness was going to be the only thing, then Colin Kaepernick kneeling and athletes around the world kneeling before sporting events, that would be okay, because it was a silent protest. And so I think we need all of those things in an ecosystem to create change. But more than anything, I think we need everyone as individuals to have some personal responsibility to be themselves, authentically themselves. If you're a yeller in the streets, do that. If you're quiet in the boardroom, do that. But to be committed to making change every day and having a personal stake in it and having some urgency, and not just saying, well, I'm not disabled, I'm not Indigenous, I'm not Black, so that's for them to handle. I think we all just have to play our role in whatever way that shows up for us.
So I think that my message is that these issues are not technical and are not financial. They are political. And in the 1 minute that you gave us, I'm going to find $8 billion in better projects. Look, I mentioned that the premier wants to do the same train, except that instead of above ground, he wants to put it on the ground, $2.8 billion. Mayor Tory wants to have an elevated highway, torn down and rebuilt 100 meters to the north. That is going to cost $1 billion more than a wonderful avenue boulevard with sidewalks and trees and bikeways and so. So that's another billion. And then again, city and province, they want to do a 3-stop subway instead of a 17-stop light rail that would connect all of Scarborough from east to west and north to south, putting $4 billion more. So right there in those three, we could have better projects with $8 billion less. And what do we do with those $8 billion? Let's focus on our most vulnerable people. The most vulnerable by age is the children and the elderly, but also everyone that is poor, everyone that has disabilities, people of racial minorities, of ethnic minorities, and in many cases, women. So if everything we did in our city, I mean, the call to action is that we must stop irresponsible spending and we must focus on the vulnerable citizens. And everyone has to do their part. Each one's part is different. but we need to do it. And people that have positions of responsibility or elected officials, then they have a bigger microphone. So their part should be even bigger than others. But we have too many civic leaders, quote unquote, mute, seeing all of this irresponsible spending right in front of our eyes when we have huge problems of housing, of child poverty, of homelessness, and we have the money. We just, but we don't have the decision. So we need to act on this now.
Yeah, and I'm appreciating this, and for those of you who are here with us, I'm going to close really quickly, but I do want to just say this piece on the pluralism and getting out of binaries, which is sort of where Chúk started today. That we've just painted these, like, you know, these stories, these archetypes, you know, out of all these old norms, and I think, you know, even Guillermo, you've closed us on one that's really important, which is to start to think about what the pluralism of action looks like. You don't have to be, you know, you've gotten a few nominations on the chat, mayor, president, all the, but there's also, so you should do that. And then there's also, you know, the everyday actions that folks on the panel can be thinking, or in the audience can be thinking about, which is there is a pluralism around action. As I close, I want to give a prompt to everyone on the call to think of one word. Don't type it in the chat yet. Just think of one word to summarize where you're at, how your energy is. And I'm going to prompt us all to put it in at the same time. So just hold on to your word while I say a huge thank you to the three of you for your generosity, for your work, for your commitment and your perseverance. You know, you talked a lot about not giving up. The three of you do not give up. And I feel honored to be in the company of you and your brilliant work.